Okay, let's get into this. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take some of the most dense and important source material out there. History, theology, strategy, and we really break it down for you.
We aim to give you the most important insights, the key takeaways, so you can be informed, quickly, but also very thoroughly.
And today, we are opening up a foundational text. It's really a military and theological record all in one, the biblical book of Joshua.
It is. It's a detailed operational account, really, that chronicles this massive transition for the nation of Israel from a promise given centuries before to Abraham to the actual physical possession of a land.
So our mission for this deep dive is, well, pretty straightforward, but it's also huge. We want to go beyond just the famous stories, the walls of Jericho, the sun standing still.
Right.
We're going to focus hard on three main areas. First, that initial commission of Joshua and what the text lays out as the principles for successful leadership.
Then the conquest itself, that dramatic, often miraculous phase. And finally, the really challenging part, the transition to settlement, which, as we'll see, was, well, it was often a failure.
And all of this hinges on that critical link between a divine promise on one hand and human faithfulness or unfaithfulness on the other.
To set the stage for you chronologically, we are firmly in the 15th century BC. The Exodus from Egypt, that huge act of deliverance that most likely happened around 1446 BC.
And then came the 40 years of wandering in the desert.
Right, which was both a judgment and a final kind of preparation for the next generation, the generation that would actually inherit the land. So they finally crossed the Jordan River and enter Canaan around 1406 BC.
So what we're really looking at is this incredibly compact, high-stakes military campaign. The main conquest phase, the part we all think of, took roughly 7 years. So from about 1406 to 1399 BC.
It's an incredibly fast timeline for what was, a massive regional overhaul.
And there's a key piece of insight we need to grab right from the start, and it's the name of the book itself, Joshua.
It's profoundly significant. The name in Hebrew is Yehoshua, and it means Yahweh saves, or the Lord is salvation.
Which, for anyone thinking about the New Testament connections, is not a coincidence at all. Joshua is the Hebrew name that translates into Aramaic as Jesus.
Exactly. It's the same name. And this immediately connects Joshua's historical role to a much bigger spiritual concept. His job was bringing God's people into the physical realization, the enjoyment of God's promises.
So he's acting as a sort of type of foreshadowing of the work of Jesus.
Precisely. What Joshua was to Israel in a physical, geographical sense, the leader who gets them across the barrier, the Jordan River, and into the promised blessings, Jesus is to God's people in a total spiritual sense, the one who brings them into true rest.
That's essential context.
Yeah.
But I think it's crucial to point out, as you said, that this isn't the end of the conflict.
No, far from it. Entering the promised land was the beginning of enjoying the blessings, sure, but it was also the beginning of intense spiritual warfare against enemies that were already dug in.
Okay, so the stage is set. Let's dive into that leadership transition in Joshua chapter 1. The monumental figure of Moses is now dead.
And the Lord immediately charges Moses' longtime assistant, his aide, Joshua, son of Nun, to take up the mantle and lead, millions of people across the Jordan and into the land.
And the text immediately establishes the authority here. The charge comes directly from God himself.
And it comes with the staggering definition of the territory they're being promised. The ideal inheritance was just vast. It went from the southern desert, the Negev, all the way up to Lebanon in the north.
And then all the way east to the Euphrates River.
Which would include all of modern-day Syria, and then west to the Mediterranean Sea.
You're basically talking about the entire Fertile Crescent as the ultimate real estate deed. But how could a nomadic people, even with God's help, possibly occupy that much territory?
Well, that's the point. The basis for Joshua's success wasn't in his military genius or his charisma. It was purely in the promise of divine presence.
That's the core assurance, isn't it?
It is. The Lord tells him explicitly, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not abandon you or leave you alone." That promise, that bedrock assurance of unfailing power and presence, that's what his entire leadership rests on.
But, and this is a huge but, the text is very clear, that God's faithfulness doesn't just cancel out human responsibility.
Absolutely not. God promised them ownership of the land based on his own character, but the actual occupation, the successful settlement of that land, depended completely on Israel's actions, on their faithfulness to the covenant.
And that leads us to the blueprint for leadership. And this is where the structure of the text itself gets really fascinating.
It really does. The conditions for victory are laid out in this powerful literary device. It's called a chiastic structure.
So it's like a mirror pattern, right?
Yeah.
ABCDA.
Exactly. It's a mirrored pattern, and the whole point is to put the most important idea right there in the center. And that's what we see here. The twin demands for success are placed right at the heart of God's charge to Joshua.
So on one side of that central point, you have this demand for unswerving obedience.
Right. The command to carefully obey all the law that Moses gave them with that specific warning. Do not swerve from it to the right or to the left. No shortcuts, no compromises, no improvising the rule book.
And then its partner, repeated over and over, is courage and confidence.
3 times, just in chapter 1. Be strong and brave, don't be afraid, and don't panic.
And the text directly links fear with a lack of trust. To tremble or be afraid would basically be to betray a lack of confidence in God's promise that he is with you.
It's a failure to trust. Think about that for a second. The failure to be strong and courageous is essentially a failure to believe God's promise. The text is setting it up so that if Israel fails later, the fault isn't God's, it's theirs.
Let's dig into that idea of obedience a little more, especially when it comes to the law scroll itself. The command wasn't just to, have it.
No, it was, this law scroll must not leave your lips. You must memorize it day and night so you can carefully obey all that is written in it.
This gets at a critical difference between just knowing something in theory and actually executing it.
It does. When the text says they must meditate on it, we need to understand what that meant in this context. This isn't a philosophical speculation about legal fine points. That's what some religious leaders did much later.
So it's not passive reflection, it's active.
Completely active. It meant practical study for the sole purpose of action, a commitment to perpetual awareness. The law had to be in the heart for motivation, on the mouth for teaching, and in the hand for action. It's like a soldier internalizing battle drills until they're instinct.
I see the modern parallel. It's like the difference between reading a brilliant business plan and actually executing it in the market. You can know all the steps, but if you don't internalize them and act consistently,
You won't get the promised success. That's the essential insight. Knowing the law is step 1. Practicing it is what leads to effectiveness and victory. If they could just maintain that constant internalized awareness of what God required, they would win.
And that brings us to the corporate side of this. Joshua wasn't just getting a personal pep talk. He was commissioning the entire nation.
That's right. He immediately turns and charges the people. And he specifically calls out the leaders of the 2.5 tribes, the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh.
The ones who had already gotten their land on the east side of the Jordan.
Exactly. The temptation for them would have been to just, settle down and relax. Their fight was over.
But Joshua reminds them of their promise. He says, your families and livestock can stay put, but every single one of your warriors has to cross over armed for battle, and you have to go ahead of your brothers.
You fight with them until the conquest is complete and the other 9.5 tribes are settled.
It just underscores how absolutely critical corporate unity was. To succeed in this national task, they had to move beyond their own tribal interests and commit to the fight together.
The collective destiny depended on individual sacrifice. It was all or nothing.
Okay, so before we jump into the actual battles, we need to understand the huge theological shift that happens when they cross the Jordan River.
Right. We said earlier that entering the land is not a symbol for heaven. Heaven is rest from labor. This is the exact opposite.
This is the point of no return. The 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, that's kind of like the experience of a believer who hasn't fully committed yet, who is still walking in the flesh.
That's a great way to put it. Provision is there, but it's day to day, and their commitment is sporadic at best. Crossing the Jordan is the full commitment to spiritual warfare. Canaan isn't the absence of hostility. It's where the real fight starts.
And the first target is the fortress city of Jericho. This time, Joshua is cautious.
Very cautious. He sends 2 spies secretly from a place called Shittim. He's specifically scouting Jericho, but he's also trying to avoid a repeat of that disastrous spy mission 40 years earlier at Kadesh Barnea,
where the public report caused a massive rebellion.
He learned the lesson. Strategic intelligence needs to be handled by leaders, not spread around a population that's prone to panic.
And these 2 spies end up at the house of Rahab, a prostitute.
Which was probably a strategic choice. An establishment like hers would have people coming and going from all over, so the presence of a couple of strangers wouldn't be as suspicious.
And here's the really surprising part. Rahab's faith in Yahweh, in Israel's God, leads her to hide the spies.
Yeah, she hides them under stalks of flax on her roof when the king of Jericho's men come looking. This wasn't about money or local politics for her.
Her confession of faith is one of the most remarkable in the entire Old Testament.
It is. She tells the spies, I know the Lord is handing this land over to you. We are absolutely terrified of you. And then she lists God's greatest hits, the Red Sea crossing, the annihilation of the Amorite kings.
So her statement that the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below proves something really profound.
It proves that God had already fulfilled his promise to put fear into the Canaanites. It's this incredible irony where Israel's enemies recognize God's power before Israel itself fully did. The Canaanites' morale was already broken.
So Rahab sees the spiritual reality behind the military one, and she asks for a covenant of allegiance. Spare my family because I've shown loyalty to God's messengers.
And the spies agree, but on 3 very specific conditions. 1, she has to tie a red rope in the window she lets them down from a visible sign.
2, she has to gather her entire family inside that one house, sheltering under that sign.
And 3, she has to keep their mission a secret. Her deliverance and her family's depended entirely on believing a promise and then acting on it.
It's this beautiful, dramatic example of grace right in the middle of a story about judgment. The spies are technically violating the command in Deuteronomy not to spare anyone in the land.
But her story demonstrates that overarching principle of grace that goes beyond nationality or background. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Her life was spared because of her faith and the action that faith demanded.
So the spies get back. They're confident now. They report that the land is paralyzed by fear. The Israelites then prepare to cross the Jordan.
Yes, they camp at the river for a 3-day period of consecration, which emphasizes the holiness, the seriousness of the task ahead.
And the Ark of the Covenant, that symbol of God's presence, is the one that leads the way.
Right, and the people have to keep a distance, about 3,000 feet, almost a kilometer, to emphasize that God is leading, not them, and so they can all clearly see the way forward.
And the crossing itself is just. It's pure drama. It's designed to establish Joshua's authority, just like the Red Sea crossing established Moses's.
And the text makes a point to tell us that the Jordan was at flood stage, it was harvest time, it was the absolute worst, most impossible time to try and cross a river like that.
But the moment the priests carrying the ark step into the water,
The water just stops flowing. It piles miles upstream at a town called Adam, and the riverbed dries up. All of Israel crosses on dry ground, right opposite Jericho.
it was this undeniable miracle that showed God was with them and was working through Joshua. It cemented his leadership for that entire generation.
Once they're across, we get to the memorial stones in chapter 4, which is so crucial. 12 men, 1 from each tribe, go back into the middle of the riverbed, and each gets a stone.
And they set them up as a permanent memorial at their new camp, Gilgal.
This had a profound dual purpose. First, it was for the current generation to remember the miracle and link it back to the Red Sea, confirming God's faithfulness. But second, and maybe even more importantly, it was an educational tool.
For future generations.
Exactly. The idea was that when their children would see these stones and ask, what do these mean? The parents would be required to tell the whole story, to explain God's power and faithfulness in detail.
The ultimate goal, then, was that all the nations of the earth might hear about it and recognize God's power, and that Israel itself would always obey him. The miracle and the monument were all about instilling lasting faith and obedience.
Following that, there's this necessary covenant renewal at Gilgal. First up, circumcision. All the men who were born during those 40 years in the wilderness hadn't been circumcised.
So this was about renewing that covenant commitment which had been neglected.
Right. And the Lord says, today I have taken away the disgrace of Egypt from you.
What exactly was the disgrace of Egypt?
It was 2 things. It was the physical mark of slavery, but it was also the charge, the taunt from their enemies that Yahweh had just led them out into the wilderness to die, that he couldn't finish what he started. By bringing them into the land, God rolled away that reproach.
It's a deep concept. It was easier to get Israel out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of Israel.
That's a great way of saying it. This act was about removing the last bit of that psychological and spiritual slavery.
So after they heal, they celebrate the Passover, remembering their redemption from slavery. And the very next day, they eat the food of the land for the first time, and the manna stops.
Forever, a powerful symbol of transition. God's miraculous daily provision was over. They were now in the land, relying on its bounty, which required their labor. They were fully invested.
And then there's one final, crucial divine encounter before the campaign kicks off.
Yes. Joshua sees a figure with a drawn sword and learns he is the commander of the Lord's army.
This confirmed that God himself, through a divine representative, would be leading Israel's forces.
And when Joshua asks, are you for us or for our enemies? The commander's response is so telling. He says, neither. I have come as commander of the Lord's army. The question isn't whose side God is on, it's whether Joshua and Israel are on God's side.
And he's told to take off his sandals because the ground is holy.
Which confirms this is the same God who appeared to Moses at the burning bush. The message was crystal clear. God is leading this charge, and Israel must follow his specific instructions to the letter.
Okay, so with all that preparation done, the conquest begins. First target, Jericho.
Yeah.
Heavily fortified, locked up tight, because they are terrified of the Israelites.
And the strategy God dictates is just. It's completely contrary to any human military logic.
Yeah.
It's all about faith and obedience, not siege engines or brute force.
They march around the city once a day for 6 days in silence.
And then on the 7th day, they march around it 7 times, and then the priests blow the ram's horns, the people let out a massive battle cry, and the walls collapse.
Just fall down flat.
Completely. The whole point of the strategy was to make it undeniable that the victory came from God's power, not their own military skill.
And that victory came with a very specific, very rigid policy. It's known as Aram, or the ban.
Right. Jericho and everything in it had to be set apart for the Lord. All the people and animals were annihilated, and the valuable metals, silver, gold, bronze, iron, went into the Lord's treasury.
The source material is clear that the ban served 2 crucial functions.
It did. First, it was a long overdue judgment on the inhabitants for their extreme wickedness. But second, and this was vital for Israel, it prevented contamination, the wealth, the culture of Jericho. It was all a potential spiritual trap. By destroying it or consecrating it to God, Israel was protected from the temptation of idolatry.
Except, of course, for Rahab and her family.
The clear exception. They were spared because of their faith and brought into the nation of Israel, a perfect example of grace in the middle of judgment.
Then, before they burn the city, Joshua places this solemn curse on anyone who tries to rebuild it.
Yes, that they'd lose their firstborn son when they laid the foundation and their youngest when they put up the gates. It wasn't just a prediction, it was an ethical statement, forbidding the reestablishment of a place that was so completely devoted to destruction.
So after this incredible, perfect victory, Israel must have been on a high. Maybe too high?
Way too high, because immediately after Jericho, they suffer a humiliating defeat at a much smaller town called Ai.
Their intelligence was bad, and their attitude was arrogant.
Completely. They only sent about 3,000 men thinking it'll be an easy win. They don't even consult God for a specific strategy. And they get routed. 36 men die, and the nation's courage just melts.
And this causes a crisis of faith for Joshua. He's on his face before the ark, questioning God, asking why he brought them across the Jordan just to let them be destroyed.
It's a real moment of doubt, and the Lord's response is the turning point here. He doesn't blame the enemy. He doesn't accept blame himself. He points the finger directly inward and says, Israel has sinned.
And this introduces this really challenging idea of corporate guilt or corporate solidarity.
Right. The Lord reveals that one man, Achan, from the tribe of Judah, had stolen some of the loot from Jericho that was under the ban. He defied a direct command. And in this covenant structure, Israel was seen as one unified body. So one man's deliberate, high-handed defiance contaminated the entire camp.
It's like a deadly infection in a body.
Exactly. God says, I will no longer be with you unless you destroy what has contaminated you. Their failure wasn't because of God's lack of power. It was because of their own internal corruption.
So they identify Achan through a process of casting lots, and he confesses.
And his confession is this perfect, tragic illustration of the progression of sin. It's a pattern you see everywhere, from the Garden of Eden to King David.
Let's break that down because it's a really powerful insight.
It's a 3-step cycle. First, it's sight and covetousness. Achan says, I saw among the goods a nice robe from Babylon, 200 silver pieces, and a bar of gold. He lets the sight of something attractive and forbidden grow into this overwhelming desire.
And he moves to overt action. The thought becomes the deed.
Right. I wanted them, so I took them. The mental sin of coveting immediately becomes the physical sin of theft.
And finally, the cover-up.
They are hidden in the ground right in the middle of my tent. He tries to conceal his sin instead of confessing it, which just compounds the problem.
The consequence was severe. Achan, his entire family, probably because they knew about it and helped hide it, and all of his possessions were destroyed by stoning and burning.
Only after that sin was purged from the camp did the Lord's anger subside. And this sets up this incredibly powerful theological contrast.
Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, hides spies and is saved by faith.
And Achan, the Israelite man from a leading tribe, hides stolen loot and is destroyed by disobedience.
The message is clear. Don't look for the reason for defeat in God or in your circumstances. The source of failure is always internal disobedience among God's people.
So once that was dealt with, Israel was ready for a second attempt at A, and this time God is intimately involved. He gives them the specific strategy.
A surprise ambush. 30,000 warriors hiding behind the city.
Right. Joshua and the main army would pretend to be defeated again, drawing the entire army of Ai out of the city in pursuit.
And the signal was Joshua holding out his curved sword?
Yes. When he gave that signal, the ambush rose up, seized the empty city, and set it on fire. The men of Ai saw the smoke, turned around, and found themselves trapped between two Israelite forces. It was a total disaster for them.
A complete victory. 12,000 people annihilated. And this time, following God's explicit orders, they were allowed to plunder the city.
And that highlights the difference. God gives victory when his people acknowledge their dependence on him, trust him, and most importantly, obey his word exactly as it's given.
So, with that central victory now secured and the internal sin dealt with, Israel immediately shifts focus. They travel north to Shechem for covenant renewal.
Which was a huge undertaking, about a 30-mile journey for the whole nation. But the location was deeply significant. Shechem is where God first promised the land to Abraham.
It's solidifying that connection to the original covenant.
Exactly. And Joshua builds an altar there on Mount Ebal, made of uncut stones, just as the law commanded, signifying that you can't shape or manipulate God's requirements with human tools.
And the entire population, men, women, children, even foreigners living with them, participates in this ceremony.
The law is read aloud, the blessings from Mount Gerizim and the curses from Mount Ebal. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Your right to possess this land is tied directly to your public, absolute submission to God's covenant.
Obedience means rest and possession. Failure means you have to deal with the guilt and return to God. It was a national reset.
But the very next chapter reveals this massive leadership failure, the deception of the Gibeonites.
Right. The other kings in the region see what happened to Jericho and Ai, and they finally form a defensive alliance against Israel.
But the people of Gibeon, they're terrified, and they try a different tactic. They know God commanded the annihilation of the local tribes, so they use deception. They show up at the Israelite camp at Gilgal looking like they've traveled from a far-off land.
Worn-out clothes, patched sandals, moldy bread, the whole 9 yards.
And this is where Israel fails the test. The leaders, they examine the evidence, they question the Gibeonites, but the text explicitly says they failed to ask the Lord's advice.
They relied on their own judgment, on what they could see and touch.
They relied on human senses and logic, and it failed them. They made a peace treaty and sealed it with a solemn oath sworn in Yahweh's name, the strongest bond possible.
And 3 days later, they find out the Gibeonites are their next-door neighbors.
The community is furious. They realize they've been tricked. But the oath, sworn in God's name, can't be broken, even if it was secured by deception. That's how seriously they took an oath.
So the Gibeonites are condemned to be servants, woodcutters, and water carriers for the altar, integrated into Israel's service instead of being wiped out.
It's a devastating lesson. They learned that obedience was key for victory, but they hadn't yet learned that they needed divine guidance for every single decision, not just the big military ones.
And this deceptive treaty immediately has consequences.
Yeah.
The Gibeonites become the target of an Amorite alliance. 5 kings attack Gibeon for making peace with Israel.
And the Gibeonites called Joshua for help, forcing Israel to honor their oath. Joshua and his army march all night from Gilgal for a surprise attack, which kicks off the southern campaign.
And God intervenes dramatically. First, with a massive hailstorm.
And the text is careful to point out that the hailstones killed more of the enemy than Israel's swords did. The Lord was literally fighting for them.
And then we get to the most famous miracle in the entire book.
Yeah.
The long day.
Right. The battle is going well, but daylight is fading. Joshua realizes if the enemy escapes to their fortified cities under the cover of darkness, the victory will be incomplete.
So with just audacious faith, he prays, O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Ajalon.
And it happens. The text says the sun stood motionless in the middle of the sky for about a full day. It was such a profound event, it was even recorded in another historical source, the Scroll of the Upright One.
The text sums it up. The Lord listened to a human being, for the Lord fought for Israel.
It's incredible. God suspends the laws of the universe to ensure a military objective is completed. After that, Joshua executes the 5 enemy kings and sweeps through the south, conquering city after city.
Then the fight shifts to the north. King Gibeon of Hazor organizes this huge coalition. Their armies are numerous as the sand on the seashore, and they have horses and chariots.
The state-of-the-art military technology of the day, a truly overwhelming threat.
And the Lord reassured Joshua, but he gives him these very specific, almost counterintuitive instructions.
He tells them they have to hamstring the horses, make them useless for war, and burn the chariots.
Which seems crazy. Why give up such an advantage?
It was a test, a critical one. God was preventing Israel from starting to rely on human military technology instead of him. They couldn't adopt the Canaanite way of war. They had to rely solely on God's power.
So Joshua does it. He attacks by surprise, wins a huge victory, and burns Hazor, the enemy capital, to the ground.
And the text makes a key theological point here. It says God determined to make the kings obstinate, to harden their hearts, so they would attack Israel and be completely annihilated.
Which in turn protected Israel from the temptation of making treaties and falling into idolatry.
Exactly. So the summary of the conquest is that Joshua campaigned for a long time, defeated 31 kings, and broke the back of the combined Canaanite military power. But, and this is a key distinction, it didn't mean every single town was conquered.
The collective fight was over. Now the individual tribes had to finish the job.
Right. And that brings us to the second half of the book, which is all about the challenging transition from campaigning to actually possessing the land.
Joshua is very old,
Yeah.
and the text says a great deal of land remains to be conquered.
This is the pivotal moment. The initial 7-year blitz broke the enemy's power, but now the real work of settlement begins. The land is divided among the tribes by casting lots.
Which required huge faith, because they were being allotted land they hadn't actually conquered yet. They were claiming it based on God's promise, not their current possession.
Each tribe was now responsible for clearing out the remaining pockets of resistance in its own territory.
And this is where we see the incredible faith of Caleb stand in such stark contrast to everyone else's hesitation.
Before the lots are even drawn, Caleb, who is now 85 years old, steps up and requests the hill country of Hebron, which Moses had promised him 45 years earlier.
And Hebron was not an easy inheritance. It was still inhabited by the Anakites, the giants that terrified the spies decades before,
Right.
in huge fortified cities.
He literally asks for the hardest place left, and his motivation is just pure strength and faith. He says, I am today 85 years old. I am still as strong as when Moses sent me out. He wants the challenge because he remembers God's power.
He didn't ask for the easy valley, he asked for the fortified hills. And he succeeds. He drives out the giants and conquers Hebron.
He is the ideal. He totally follows God and takes what was promised, no matter how intimidating the enemy looks. But tragically, his example is not the norm.
No. We see the tribe of Judah failing to conquer the Jebusites in Jerusalem. The Ephraimites fail to drive out the people of Gezer.
These are the first critical signs of spiritual erosion. They stopped short of complete obedience. They settled for partial victory, allowing pockets of Canaanites to remain, which was the very thing Deuteronomy warned would lead to their downfall.
And that failure, that apathy, leads directly to Joshua having to scold them at Shiloh in chapter 18.
Yes, the tabernacle, the center of worship, is set up at Shiloh, but 7 of the tribes haven't even bothered to survey or occupy their allotted land yet. They're just idling.
So Joshua has to light a fire under them. He says, how long do you intend to put off occupying the land the Lord has given you?
Their failure wasn't a lack of power, it was a lack of will. He has to force them to go and survey the land so they can finish the allotments. He has to literally push them to take the blessing God has already given them.
So with the land finally divided, they formalize some key legal structures, like the cities of refuge.
6 cities, 3 on each side of the Jordan. They were a place of asylum for anyone who accidentally killed someone to protect them from the avenger of blood until they could have a fair trial. It's a system of justice balanced with mercy.
And the Levites, the priestly tribe, they don't get a territory. They're given 48 cities spread throughout the other tribes.
Right, so they can perform their teaching and priestly duties for the whole nation. Their inheritance was spiritual, not physical.
But this period of settlement is immediately rocked by a near disaster. The 2.5 eastern tribes are finally sent home.
They're commended for their faithful service. But as they cross back over the Jordan, they build this huge, impressive altar.
And the Western tribes see this and immediately conclude it's apostasy. It's a violation of the law that forbids any altar other than one at the central sanctuary.
They prepare for civil war, which shows how seriously they took covenant fidelity, even if they jumped to the wrong conclusion here.
Thankfully, they send a delegation led by Phinehas the priest to investigate first.
And the eastern tribes explain, the altar wasn't for sacrifice. It was a memorial, a witness, a reminder for their own children, for future generations, that they were still part of the 12 tribes of Israel, even though a river separated them.
So war is averted. Phinehas is satisfied. But the text still notes that the action, even with good motives, was unwise.
It was unwise because it wasn't ordained by God, and it created a massive misunderstanding. It's that classic problem of doing something that seems good instead of doing what God specifically commanded.
And that brings us to the end of the book, to Joshua's farewell addresses. He's very old, near the end of his life, and he gathers all the leaders for one last urgent message.
He starts by reminding them of God's perfect faithfulness. He says not one of God's promises failed. Everyone was realized. God did his part completely. Any failures were on Israel's side.
And because of that, he issues this powerful challenge. If God was so faithful to keep his promises of blessing, you have to understand he will be just as faithful to keep his warnings of discipline.
It's a sharp warning. He says if you turn away, if you intermarry and worship the gods of the nations still in the land, the Lord will stop helping you.
And worse, those nations will become a trap for you, a whip that tears your sides and thorns that blind your eyes until you disappear from the land.
It's the double-edged sword of God's character. He is just as faithful to judge transgression as he is to bless obedience.
So Joshua organizes one final covenant renewal at Shechem. He gives them this powerful history lesson.
He pulls no punches. He starts with Abraham's family, reminding them that their own ancestors served other gods beyond the Euphrates. He reviews the Exodus, the conquest, reminding them that their victory came from God's terror that went ahead of them, not their own strength.
It's designed to strip them of any pride. You came from idolatry, you were delivered by grace, you won by God's power.
And then comes the final demand. Choose today whom you will worship, but I and my family will worship the Lord.
And the people immediately swear their loyalty. We will worship the Lord.
But Joshua, who knows their hearts, gives this sobering reply. You will not keep worshiping the Lord, for he is a holy God, a jealous God who will not forgive your rebellion or your sins.
That is a devastating insight. He knew they still had idols in their possession. He tells them to put aside the foreign gods that are among you, which means even as they were making these vows, they were still holding on to the very thing that caused the defeat at Ai.
He's warning them that persistent, unrepentant sin forfeits God's mercy. God is at war with sin because it destroys the very people he loves.
So Joshua makes a final agreement, sets up a large stone as a witness to their oath, and sends them to their allotments. It's the end of an era.
Joshua dies at 110. And the text gives this sad, ominous summary. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived him, the ones who had seen firsthand what God had done.
But after that generation passed, the history of Israel goes straight downhill into the chaos of the book of Judges.
The book of Joshua is this incredible testimony to God's faithfulness. But it's also a stark demonstration that possessing the blessing depends entirely on accepting God's standard, abandoning yourself to his will, and obeying his covenant, which is exactly where the next generation failed.
You know, what really stands out in this deep dive is that central tension we followed all the way through. You have the overwhelming evidence of God's power on one side, drying up a river, stopping the sun.
Giving them perfect military strategies.
Right. And on the other side, you have this constant stumbling struggle of human faithfulness, whether it's one man's greed like Achan, or leadership failure with the Gibeonites, or just collective apathy at Shiloh.
The message is just singular, really. The fundamental requirement for victory over our spiritual adversaries, the world, the flesh, the devil, it's unswerving, consistent obedience. It's that perpetual awareness of God's requirements, that practical meditation we talked about.
So if you're looking for the reason for defeat, the source material forces you to look inward. Man is on the hot seat for failure, not God.
Right. And what does this all mean for you, for us? We see the pattern so clearly. One generation's strength and resolve built the foundation. The next generation's apathy let it all crumble.
The source material notes that investing in and building up the next generation preserves the present generation. You see the faithfulness of Joshua's generation and then the rapid decline right after they're gone.
So if possessing the promised land, if enjoying the fullness of God's blessing, hinges entirely on consistent covenant and faithfulness across generations, we have to ask ourselves.
How do we make sure the foundations of faith and success we build today are robust enough to withstand those thorns that blind the eyes, as Joshua warned, for the next generation? It's not enough to just possess the map. You have to train the next generation to read it and follow it, especially into the hardest territory. It demands persistent action, not just a verbal vow. What steps are you taking today to solidify that legacy?